Hi, my name is Lisa Pugh, and I work for the ARC Wisconsin. I'm here with my colleague Sally Flaschberger, who works for our state's Protection and Advocacy Agency, Disability Rights Wisconsin, and we are providing a report to the Advocacy Institute from the State Superintendent's Equity in Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA Stakeholder Council. I've been providing some regular reports. Sally's new to the committee, and so we had our fourth meeting today. It's the first one for Sally, and we had an agenda where we were split into two different groups, and I was on the accountability group. We're talking about state level accountability. And Sally, what was your group?
I was on the school improvement subgroup, and where we talked about what the plan is going to look like and how they're going to determine rigorous interventions.
So both of our roles in this committee is to really look out for that student subgroup of students with disabilities and make sure there's a voice in the equity process for achievement of students with disabilities and how we can address that pretty significant achievement gap for that group of students in our state. So hopefully what we talked to you about and what we've learned in our own state process can help you think about how you can intervene in your process. We started out today by talking about the timeline. So, and they shared a timeline with us on how things are looking in Wisconsin. We are a state that chose to wait for the second plan submission period, which has now been extended. So originally, states were told that they needed to have their plans submitted by July, and now that's been extended till September. So that gives a state like Wisconsin some additional time for discussion with stakeholders, public input, and then there are some required processes, including 30 days for the governor to review, which in our state will happen in August. So a first step for your state would really be to understand where you are at in your state plan submission and where the public input processes are, and if there is an equity stakeholder counselor similar to Wisconsin, that you could participate in some of that public input that's happening now, or to understand where it's going to happen later. Was there anything else in the beginning of the session that you thought was important?
No, I think it's just good. There does seem to be a diverse group of people participating on the committee. I think most committee meetings probably are open to the public, so people could go and observe even if they're not on their state council or committee.
Mm-hmm. So I think what we started out by, after talking about the timeline, we also discussed a little bit about how our process will align with our state budget process,
right.
Which might be
good discussion.
Also important to understand how that aligns in your state. So for instance, in Wisconsin, our state budget process will really start in early February and will move into its final stages in around May and June. And so what we're talking about here in our state's ESSA planning process might involve some additional allocation of resources or some discussion about more equitable allocation of resources. So we really want our legislature to be informed of this process, and we do have some legislators that are on the committee. So
I thought that was a good point, and even we do hold public hearings around our state for the budget process, and so there was some discussion of maybe doing some of the public outreach at the same time as they're holding these kind of budget hearings, maybe even in a different location. I thought that was kind of a good way to be sure that they're getting public input about the plan.
So after we had that kind of general overview, Sally and her group around school improvement, and my group around statewide accountability separated out, and we kind of talked about our bigger questions. And in our group around statewide accountability, we talked about how does the way in which we set goals, like long-term goals, draw attention to equity and help drive resources to students who may need more support. We had a lot of discussion about that. We had three kind of exercises and questions in front of us. One was, what's our balance between ambitious and achievable, and what are the discussions that we need to have in order to decide where we land on that. And we had some examples of looking at some states that had already put forward their early plans, states that had set really ambitious goals but with really long-term deadlines, and then others that were maybe less ambitious but that had shorter-term goals. And I think that our group really talked about wanting to set more along the lines of ambitious and more frequent progress monitoring with kind of a focus on what's happening with subgroups. And I think that's really important for students with disabilities to think about, kind of how do we need to move the needle for those subgroups of students that have kind of the biggest gaps to overcome, and recognition that a lot of the other subgroups, minority students, really are also concentrated and overlap with students with disabilities. So we had this dot exercise where we put dots on this arrow line of ambitious and achievable, and I think really came out toward leaning toward ambitious. I don't know if you had any reflections on that conversation when we came back in the larger group.
I think my reflection was talking about high expectations for all students. We know that students with disabilities often are not held to the same standards or high expectations, and how that we can have equity in those high expectations. And I think that was my takeaway from the accountability people understanding about that.
We also talked then about how often we should be monitoring progress, and I think I was really leaning toward encouraging the group to have more frequent progress monitoring because of the difficulty sometimes that schools have demonstrated in their ability to implement certain interventions for students with disabilities with fidelity. And if we're expecting a more accelerated rate of growth in, reducing that achievement gap for students with disabilities, we need to make sure that whatever resources we're maybe targeting, whatever interventions we are hoping schools will implement are being done well. And so without that kind of check on progress to either get in more information or support or resources to a school, we really are not going to be able to stay on target toward the progress that we expect. So the goal, I guess, after today for at least the school accountability group, or the statewide accountability group, is for our Department of Public Instruction, our state education agency, to come back with kind of the notes from today, and to come back with some ideas around long-term goals, ideas around how we'll check progress, and kind of where we fall in that balance of ambitious and achievable. Some of the unanswered questions for me that I hope we'll get to is that question around N size. You and I have talked a lot about that. N size is a very important factor when talking about students with disabilities. How are we counting that subgroup, and how do we make sure that school districts aren't able to kind of hide the achievement of that subgroup through the N size? And so I'm hoping that we'll have more conversation about that. I think we're thinking that an N size of around 10 would be ideal. We don't know if we'll get there, but I think it's important to know what your N size is in your state, and to really push for a good conversation about what is an N size that's really going to allow us to show progress in that subgroup in all school districts in your state. Did you want to talk about what happened in your group?
So our group broke off to talk about school improvement, and the initial question was about rigorous interventions, but in reality, that wasn't what we talked about. We talked more about supports and who would be providing supports, what would supports look like, how do we determine what those supports would be, and obviously those supports would encompass rigorous interventions at some point. So we kind of did the same thing. There was a line, and the local school district was on one side and the State Department of Education was on the other side, and we took the dots, and they wanted to know, where we thought these different decisions about what types of supports should be made, and then who should decide what those supports look like. And so what came from the conversation was that people fell squarely in the middle, and then we really began a conversation about community engagement, and that you must be able to engage all members of the community, especially the ones who are not who are having difficulty with equity in their school districts, and that no school improvement plan will work without that robust community engagement. So that was one of the takeaways. We did talk about the role of our State Department and how they could focus on tools. They would really be responsible for sure that there is equity, and that even in that community engagement, if for some reason a local district can't engage a certain population, a certain group of people, that the department would be responsible for really trying to bring that voice to the table in some way, and really kind of monitoring that equity even in the community engagement. We talked about that there are a lot of good things happening throughout the state, and there needs to be a way to replicate those models and make those models available to other people, and that there's very differing needs across our state in our rural schools and our urban schools, and so being sure that there are enough models to be able to look at to replicate. I think, again, when we got to who would be responsible for developing those supports, again, it came back to community. And community meant parents, community leaders, faith-based, businesses, not just the LEA. I think we had some discussion around what people believed the LEA was, and so some people believe that the LEA includes their community, but others were clear to say, and I, just from my experience with students with disabilities and in my own personal experience, the LEA is a very different definition, and they hold a lot of power for students and students with disabilities and their engagement with the parents. So that's why it was making sure that there was really that focus on community. Some of the unanswered questions is really about money, and where will the money come from to support any of these new rigorous interventions or supports. How, since we didn't get to really talking about the rigorous interventions, how is that being defined, and will individual school districts or even schools be able to define that themselves? And so still looking for guidance on what that looks like, because I think the group believes that our State Department may not be able to identify all those rigorous interventions because schools are so different. We did talk about, again, that equity in funding, and that there can be some disparities based on need, and that not all school districts need the same amount of services, and how can we fairly provide services to all without a lot of questions kind of around that kind of fair is not always equal, and so there was some discussion around that.
I think that was an interesting parting thought when both of our groups came back together at the end. We did talk about the importance of being able to message that, because I think there was some agreement that some subgroups really are going to need more attention and support and resource allocation. Right. And does that create an appearance to some parents that their child who might not be in that subgroup is not getting the same sort of support? And so I think that's something that we will struggle with. I think that, Sally and I, as people who have worked in, both good and schools in need of improvement in educating students with disabilities, can say is that when a school is doing a good job with students with disabilities and programming with fidelity, that typically all students are thriving. And so how can we share that message, and how can we share those models so that this fair is not always equal message really is something that people understand, and they get that it can be good for their school district and ultimately as a parent for their student. So
correct.
Well, hopefully our conversation's been helpful. Thank you, Sally, for joining.
Thank you,
and we will share reflections from our next meeting, which will happen in February.
All right, thanks.